Hey everyone! So today we're basically cracking open a time capsule. We're looking at a 19th century book called The History of Mankind, which was this massive attempt to catalog, well, all of humanity. Now, its worldview is, let's be honest, incredibly dated by our standards. But if you look closely, there are these flashes of insight that feel surprisingly modern. So let's dive in and see what we can find.
Right out of the gate, the author throws this curveball at his own time period. You gotta remember, this was an era when many Europeans just assumed other cultures were inferior. But here he is, making this incredible observation. He's seeing a universal human drive for beauty that just completely ignores any kind of ranking of civilizations. And that one sentence? It tells you this is going to be way more complex than you'd expect from a 19th century text.
And this leads him to a question that artists are still asking today: what is it really that makes something beautiful? He's using this question to build a bridge, between a carved bowl from Polynesia and a painting in a European gallery. He's searching for a kind of universal grammar of beauty. So let's keep that in our heads as we go. What are the common threads that he pulls on?
Okay, so to get a handle on this huge survey, we're going to follow the author's 5 big themes. We'll start with art, where you least expect it, then jump into spiritual beliefs, look at the rules of the tribe, check out designs for survival, and finally, wrap up with the big forces of war and change.
All right, so first up is that universal drive for beauty. The author is just completely captivated by the amazing craftsmanship coming from cultures that his peers would have just dismissed as simple or, well, the word he uses is rude. You can tell he's genuinely impressed, and he really wants his readers to see what he's seeing.
I mean, the sheer variety and just the dedication here is incredible. We're not talking about simple functional tools. This is high art. The author talks about a man spending years meticulously engraving a club, not to make it a better weapon, but just for the sake of beauty. He points to these powerful masks from New Ireland, some of which even used human skulls, and of course the giant figures on Easter Island. The ones that were so impressive that early Europeans basically said, no way, the islanders couldn't have made these. These objects are just such profound statements of culture, of identity, and of amazing skill.
Okay, next let's step into the spiritual world. For the author, you just can't understand these cultures without getting this piece. Spirituality wasn't, a Sunday morning thing. It was woven into every single part of life, from the tools they used to their fear of the dark. So to explain a really central idea, the author uses the word fetishism. Now, from his 19th century viewpoint, this was the belief that spirits, what he calls the countless tribe of souls, could actually live inside physical objects. So what that means is that a random object wasn't just a thing. It could be a home for a spirit, a container for real power, a direct line to the supernatural world.
And this belief shows up in some really fascinating ways. Like, in West Africa, a simple piece of paper with writing on it was considered powerful magic. The author tells this story about a doctor who dropped a prescription, and the patient literally fled his own home, convinced the house was now cursed. And get this, it wasn't just traditional stuff. Christian crosses were adopted and carried around as powerful objects on the Lower Congo. It just shows how new symbols could get folded right into this existing spiritual system.
So, from the spiritual, let's pivot to the social. How did these communities actually organize themselves? The author was totally fascinated by how different societies built their most basic relationships. Family, marriage, who gets what.
The text points out this really key difference between two systems. On one side, you've got mother right, where your family line goes through your mom, and a man's most important heir is actually his sister's son. And on the other side is the patriarchal system, where the father is the head of the family. The author had this theory that the big game changer, the thing that pushed societies toward patriarchy, was cattle breeding, because all of a sudden you have this new kind of wealth that moves, and fathers could control it and pass it down, totally changing the whole family dynamic.
And here's one of those amazing contradictions that the author just loves to point out. In Polynesia, he saw that marriage seemed pretty casual. Divorce was easy to get. So you might think, okay, they're probably relaxed about all family rules. But not at all. The rules against incest were, and I'm quoting him here, incredibly stern. So stern, in fact, that if twins of the opposite sex were born, they might be killed just to prevent any future possibility. It's a really powerful reminder that social norms are almost never simple. Now let's get practical. Let's talk about survival. How did people feed themselves? Where did they live? This part of the book is just this incredible testament to human ingenuity, showing all these clever solutions for dealing with completely different environments. I love this example. It paints such a vivid picture of clever engineering without any fancy technology. Just imagine it, a line of guys, each holding a pointed wooden stake.
They don't have a plow, so instead, they coordinate their strength to act like a single machine. They jam their beams into the ground at the same time, and then, on a single command, they heave up this massive chunk of soil. It's just such an elegant and powerful solution to a basic problem.
And of course, shelter is just as important as food. The book documents this incredible spectrum of homes. You've got nomadic people living in caves on one end, and then these super sophisticated snow structures in the polar regions. For safety, the island Gadis of Luzon literally built their homes in the treetops. And then at the other extreme, you have the Pueblo Indians, who created these massive dwellings that the author described as a mix of caves and castles. Every single home is a direct answer to the climate, the available materials, and what the society needed.
And that brings us to our final section, the huge forces that completely reshape societies. For this author, history wasn't something that just sat still. No, it was this dynamic, messy process, and it was driven by conflict, by migration, and by the disruptive shock of new technology.
That is a pretty bleak statement, right? And it gets right to the heart of the author's belief, that conflict was the #1 engine of history. He didn't see war as some kind of interruption of normal life. He saw it as this constant pressure that defined relationships between tribes, that forced people to move, and that formed the very core of all their stories and legends.
But what's really interesting is that war wasn't always just about aggression. He gives this brilliant case study from Africa that shows how economics completely dictated what war looked like. So, a shepherd tribe with very limited food, they killed their prisoners because they simply couldn't feed them. Their neighbors, the agricultural Wakamba, they enslaved prisoners because they could put them to work on their farms. But then you have the Wanyamwezi, who had access to Arab trade routes. They waged war for the specific purpose of capturing people to sell as slaves. 3 different economies created 3 totally different reasons for and approaches to war.
And finally, the author shows that change could happen unbelievably fast. He calls the arrival of firearms the single most sharply defined epoch in the history of these peoples. It instantly turned power balances completely upside down. But he also tracks the lightning-fast spread of something else, a cultural habit, tobacco. In just a handful of years, it swept across entire groups of islands, becoming totally normal. It's just this perfect example of how dynamic and incredibly adaptable these cultures really were.
So, as we wrap this up, we're left with this final question. A book like The History of Mankind is really 2 artifacts in one. Yes, it tells us a lot about the incredible diversity of human cultures as they were seen back in the 19th century. But it also tells us just as much about the person doing the observing, his assumptions, his biases, and even his moments of genuine, surprising insight. It's a powerful reminder that every history book is a story being told by someone from somewhere. Thanks so much for joining me.